All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TME Presents Optimizing Value Through Strategic Asset Management. You've read the article, so now learn the rest of the story. I'm Daniel Wheatley, the Associate Editor for the Military Engineer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we get started with today's event, though, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to best participate. All the attendees are in the listen-only mode for the presentation. You can use the chat pane to chat with your fellow attendees. Everyone, let's try that now by typing in where we're listening from today. I'll start. I'm coming to you from a rainy day in Northern Virginia. You can submit questions for our presenters at any time by using the questions pane of the control panel. We will collect these and address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you see a question you like, click on the thumb up icon under it to upvote it. This will help it rise to the top of the list. Please also submit any technical issues you may be encountering here as well. You will be able to download the slide deck and your PDH certificate from the handouts pane at the conclusion of today's presentation. Ensuring continued success of the federal infrastructure assets that manage America's natural water resources requires operating and maintaining as effectively and efficiently as possible. Originally published in the September-October 2021 issue of TME, Optimizing Value Through Strategic Asset Management discussed a recently developed asset management plan for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works program that seeks to improve consistency across geographic offices through standardized criteria and identification of enterprise-level optimizations for infrastructure strategy and investment. We'll discuss that plan and more in today's webinar. But before we do that, I'd like to do a quick poll to see who all is listening. So take a moment here and fill out which one of these following roles best describes you: a federal agency representative, a technical consultant or representative, or some other role. If so, put it in chat. So we'll keep this open for just a little bit to get some questions in here. We see right now we've got about 60, 57, 60-ish% technical consultants, 33% federal agency representatives. It's pretty good. And about 10% of you are others. Now we've got some retired people. Great to have you with us still listening. All right. We'll close that out there. So the final results here: 34% federal agency representatives, 56% technical consultants or representatives, and 9% others. Great to have you all here with us. And with that, I'd like to introduce the article's authors and today's featured speakers. Peter Dodgion is Civil Works Asset Management Chief, USACE. Dr. Matthew Smith is Technical Director, Geotechnical and Structures Laboratory, ERDC. And Emily Seamster is Strategic Consultant with Woolpert. With that, I'll turn it over to our featured speakers for their presentation.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks for everybody in attendance today for your time and interest in this subject. As Daniel mentioned, we have published an article about the progress of Civil Works Asset Management Program and the impact it is trying to have on the organization to improve its value. We have several learning objectives today on the next slide that we would like to cover to give you an overview of what happened and what was included in the article, but also just to give a little bit more understanding of what's happening in civil works, gain an awareness of the principles of asset management itself as well for those who may not be as familiar, to learn about the evolution of the asset management program in the Corps of Engineers Civil Works, as well as understand how the principles of a newly published strategic asset management plan is helping the Corps advance their whole asset management program. And lastly, we wanted to recognize and give a little bit of lessons learned and about the importance of understanding the SAMP in projects, as well as how asset management can have impacts on other asset owners. And the next slide, before we go forward a little bit, though, I'd like to turn it over to Peter Dodgion, the Asset Management Program Manager at the Corps, just to give a little bit of an overview of civil works as well. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And Emily, the characteristics of our new world, I'm suddenly having a little bit of technical difficulty. So if my audio is too choppy, give me a signal or something.
No,
and I'll close off my video.
No, you sound great.
Okay, great. Yeah. So first of all, I think let's talk a little bit about U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works, just for context. The couple of things I want to make clear is, the Army Corps of Engineers is not a military program. It's a civil works program, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the real message of what I'm going to talk about here for a second is that if we can do this, anyone can. And the reason I would point that out is, you say civil works, you can see the kind of, there's a nice picture there, the kind of thing, the kind of asset, the object, high level objects that we manage. And, they're obviously not military, they're large infrastructure, water resources infrastructure. And a lot of people don't know this, but each one was independently developed on its own merits to meet its own purposes. It was authorized. Largely, there's a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, each one of these structures is authorized. And what that leads to is that in the ongoing, the world that we manage these assets in, each one is independently financed. And they're financed on their own merits. They have their own value that they deliver, and they're financed independently. And then organizationally, although we bundle these assets together under organizational headings, districts and divisions around the regions, each one of the assets are still an individual creature from a financial and authorization standpoint. And so it's difficult to move funds between these assets. This makes asset management very, very tricky when you're doing risk trade-offs, and sometimes you want to follow those analyses up with movement of resources. Very difficult because of the way that they're. And we also have a very diffuse leadership and management structure. We are organized by watersheds across the nation from coast to coast. Into large major subordinate commands and then districts, and then these assets are put in sort of assigned to each of these districts, each of these organizational units, based on where they sit in a watershed sort of a context. Dams, 600 dams is a good number to think about. 70 or so riverine facilities that you'd recognize. The average age is about 60 years, about $250 billion in value. Among all these independent assets that we manage. So I think it's important to recognize some of those when we talk about what it's like to put together a system to manage risk and derive value from those assets. So Emily, if you want to talk about AM generally, we go to the next slide.
Sure, thanks, Peter. And you're right about the complex environment that civil works plays in order to coordinate all aspects of asset management, and taking a step back about what is asset management and a little bit of a history specific to the federal market as well. As the definition is here on the screen, of course, that's from the ISO 55,000 published in the 2014 time period. But asset management really does aim to coordinate the financial, operational, maintenance, and risk-related and other asset-related activities to realize more value from the things that agency might own and manage. It's not just performing maintenance on assets. I know the industry talks a lot about, are you managing assets? Are you performing asset management? It's not only just about tracking asset inventories, but it's the complexity and the integrated coordination of all aspects in order to, again, produce value, and whatever value that is really specific to that industry, right? So private organizations might see value as throughput or manufacturing output, et cetera, Well, public sectors are more about providing mission to the public, much like the Corps of Engineers. And as Peter had said in the last slide, the multi-aspect of what civil works provides, from inland navigation to flood risk management to hydropower, electricity generation, et cetera. So anyway, the concepts of asset management have been around for quite a long time, and the community of practice has really been more of a focus since the 1980s in the private and public sectors. With the writing of a publicly available standard past 55 in the early 2000s, that really kickstarted this formalization of the community of practice. And then, of course, like I said earlier, the ISO was published. ISO 55000 was published in 2014. Specific to the federal market, the implementation of asset AM concepts has been very much encouraged since 2004, when an executive order was published for federal real property asset management, and that just encouraged the efficient and economical use of America's real property assets. That's a little bit of a background, and to go in a little bit further in the next slide, the Institute of Asset Management is one of the leading professional organizations for asset management. And again, to describe this large scope of what asset management is really out to accomplish, they've put this conceptual model together that groups the scope of asset management into 6 different subject areas that are the colored items on the bottom of the slide there. Each subject area, again, broadly covers asset management principles. The model is aimed at describing what asset management includes, but also the interrelation between all of the things. So most particularly for our subject today is the strategy and planning yellow box there that really, again, tries to guide what the organization is trying to do, what their strategic plan is all about, and guides the asset management program to achieve the organization's goals and objectives using their physical assets. For the Corps, this model has helped. This particular asset management model from the IAM has helped the Corps in developing their scope of their asset management program. And it's helped in the development of a policy that Matt's going to talk about here in a second, after Peter speaks about a little bit more about the evolution. But also it's helped with a follow-on strategic asset management plan that has been described quite a lot in our article. So a little bit of background information on asset management. And thanks so much for that. I'll pass it over back to Peter, actually, to give a little bit of an evolution and history and background of what's happened in civil works regarding asset management. If you go to the next slide.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Emily. Yeah. Hey. Yeah, I'm gonna go through a timeline before I jump to that timeline, though. I do want to mention that a lot of agencies in the federal government are making this kind of transition and finding their way right now. And I know Emily and her group are involved in a lot of these. Several agencies are developing this, and so the timeline that we're going to go through is not unusual. In fact, some of my colleagues in other agencies have said that despite this, it's a roughly 20-year timeline. It's a pretty typical evolution. So let's go to the next slide and look at how this might play out. So the application of asset management principles per se. I mean, the agency has always managed assets, but to think of it as a deliberate practice, a set of I don't know, approaches to deriving value. It really began with the executive order that Emily mentioned back in 2004, and the focus was on federal real property. But it got the executive agency thinking about collecting and reporting information about their assets in a more deliberate way. And then you'll see a few years went by, not too many years, 3 or 4 years went by, and the agency began to recognize that there were some international standards forming. This PAS 55, I think it's called, that's an acronym for publicly available standard. It's related to the ISO corpus of procedures that are shared internationally to accomplish things like this. And international standards. You'll see on this timeline that we developed a strategic investment framework around 2010. We started collecting specific asset management kind of data, like condition data. You see operational condition assessment, and we started doing deliberate risk assessments. These things have always sort of been done in a colloquial sense, but we began to be more formal about that around 2010, 11, 12. And the strategic framework basically was an agency decision that we're going to use this data to make our investment decisions. We're going to sort of move away from the word of mouth sort of passing along information. We're going to start using more formal data systems to make those decisions. So let's go to the next slide. Look at the rest of the timeline. So 2013, 14, we started getting serious about maintenance management. Now, you think about asset management, a lot of folks in this business think of this portfolio level practice where you're analyzing data that's somewhat the factors feeding into are somewhat dim to you because you're separated from the assets in some way by time and space maybe, and you're having to rely on data to make decisions. Then there's a little bit more of a tactile end of that spectrum, that maintenance management and that facility level asset management. And so the agency started getting serious about clarifying what we wanted to see there to get value, to get our best value out of our maintenance decision making, and start to incorporate risk in some ways in maintenance decisions. And then this has been a theme throughout, but the portfolio analytics, the core value model there in the mid to late teens, the agency was starting to recognize that there were common tools in practice that we needed to begin to develop. A value model is not something that an agency can do overnight. That's a cross-cutting sort of look at value, and complex agencies. That's difficult to do. Most government agencies don't have the benefit of the dollar or profit as a common value principle, and so it takes some work to develop that kind of a model in the government setting. And so that process began in the mid-teens. We've gotten a little more formal with our condition assessment program about 10 years on. We've got a formal policy. You can see the OCA, Operational Condition Assessment, EC, around 2019. We started getting more formal about the program itself. 2019 also published a 5-year program management plan to lay out what this program would do to mature our asset management system over the coming 5 years. And then immediately, the director of Civil Works, who's the top civilian on the Civil Works side of the Corps of Engineers, published a policy statement with 6 policy objectives, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail in a minute, to say, hey, look, this is what I mean by life cycle portfolio management. This is what I mean by asset management. So that came out in that 2019-2020 timeframe. And right on its heels, and as a result of that policy, one of the things that policy required was to develop this SAMP that we're exploring today. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. If we can go to the next slide. So ask Matt if he could discuss a little bit more about that pivot and that the director's policy. There's a lot in there. And so if Matt, you're out there, I talked about that alignment.
Okay, you can go on to the next slide. We we're going to kind of switch gears, like Peter said, and focus very specifically on this pivot from what I guess is a focus of individual asset management activities or a group of people who are, say, doing asset management, a department of asset management, to implementing asset management throughout all of the business practices across the core. So that was one of the big themes of this maturation that's going on. You know, we want to manage assets. We want to do it smarter. Let's start this activity, that activity, and at some point, following the idea of an IAM maturation, it becomes obvious that the enterprise needs to take on the responsibilities of asset management as a whole, whether that's in engineering or planning or operations and maintenance, and to all kind of work on the same understandings of life cycles and things of that sort. And in order to do that, in order to align all these disparate business processes, we really needed an enterprise objective, a policy, a statement of our senior most leaders that say, this is the thing we value, this is the direction we're going to go. Here are very clearly stated enterprise objectives. This is what's expected, and we're going to do this as a whole agency. And so before we could get to implementing, you know, these great things, value models, condition assessment, and things across the core in an integrated fashion, across all of our business processes, we really had to have this this catalyst of a leadership decision in the form of a policy. And it took a little while to write and come up with. We socialized it amongst all of our senior leaders. And it was so important that we even had the opportunity to have it signed by our Director of Civil Works. But that particular gentleman was getting ready to retire, and we felt, you know, we really need to put this on hold. It's so important. We want the new Director of Civil Works, as he comes in, to understand it, provide input, and if they agree, then we'll have the current leadership support in figuring out where we're going to go for this. So this policy is really kind of the catalyst, the starting point, and it creates 6 objectives for the agency, and later on we're going to kind of talk about those. But its applicability, as I mentioned, is to all of the civil works elements, every community of practice, every center, every district, every division office, every operating project, every element of the core that deals with civil works. That's who this policy is for, so that we can integrate across all of those. And it really is a statement of our leadership saying, you know, we're going to be serious about asset management, and we're not going to make it up as we go. We're going to follow the international standards, 55,000 principles and requirements of what, you know, good practice asset management is. And so this was a really revolutionary step where we as an agency decided, you know, instead of a department who are providing some asset management tools, instead our agency is going to embrace asset management as a way of doing business. You go on to the next slide. And following that policy, right? So that's a statement of our leaders and our agency. These are the things that we'd like to achieve. But a policy is relatively short and saying, you know, we all of us are going to do this thing, and these are the things we're going to do. This is what we expect you to achieve. And so then the real work began. And okay, well, how are we going to figure that out? How are we going to implement these 6 objectives? As I said, they're going to be presented on in a minute, and you'll get some detail on those. But how are we going to do this? And so the asset management principles in ISO 55000 lay out this, you know, you have these enterprise objectives, those are embodied in our policy, but you have a strategic asset management plan. This is kind of an implementation plan. How are we going to get after these objectives? What activities is the agency going to develop and then implement? Who's going to do that? How are they going to be paid for? Who has the roles and responsibilities at different times of the development? Who needs to be talking to who? What education? What training? all of the particular details in pivoting an organization toward achieving some enterprise asset management objectives are encapsulated with this living document that's called the strategic asset. And so as a way of building an implementation, you go to the next slide, as a way of building an implementation plan for that policy, we started carefully putting together groups of people across different functional areas or business sectors, so to speak, in our agency, folks who deal with different business elements, whether those be hydropower or navigation or flood risk management, regulatory, but also business types, planning and policy and programming, operations, engineering, construction. So we collected a group of our thought leaders across all of our different business parts and perspectives. We had folks from districts and divisions, and we collected them together in teams to really kind of pick apart these objectives, figure out where our agency was at now, what the future needs to be, what does it mean to meet those objectives, and what are the activities and a timeline by which we need to start getting from here to where we're going to be. And so that's what we've been working on, and from that policy until now, we have written a draft SAMP. We have gotten people together, talked about everything. We've revised that, and we've finalized a working strategic asset management plan for the Corps that gives us a multi-year roadmap to get from where we are to the achievement of those corporate asset management objectives. And again, as I mentioned, the purpose of this is to inculcate these principles throughout the entire agency, rather than having an asset management department that's responsible for this tool or that tool to advise other people. We want our individual business elements to be managing the assets according to tried and true principles as a way of their daily activities. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Emily, I think, or no, Peter, to talk about the asset management objectives.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so before I get into this, this graphic exposes that, as Matt was sharing there, that asset management isn't an organization, it's a set of principles. And this is your first look at, if you haven't read the article, this is the first look at those high-level organizational objectives, those policy objectives. They're the colored column to the left, the AM policy goals, Civil Works AM policy goals. But first, let me substantiate why we are like this. Look at this graphic, right? This is not a bad representation of how an organization like the Corps aligns itself. Why is it so hard to get an organization to share a common vision of value? It's because of this kind of complexity. You can see these stovepipes, these silos running across to the right, planning and see ops. We're more complex than that even. The organizational, the jurisdictional divisions that we have in our organization, in terms of business practices and how we view value, we are very complex. And this is not an uncommon problem. Those of you who are in the asset management business know that the reason this whole field of practice exists is because many organizations are doing extremely complex things, and they solve that complexity with functional design, an organization that's functionally designed, or other organizational solutions that solve the complexity of delivering whatever the value is, whatever the good thing is. But there's a need to realign around value. Let's say after the complexity has established some basic function in the organization, and the Corps is no different. And so the role of my program, the role of the asset management program, and this strategy is to inculcate those principles throughout a very functionally focused organization, right? We love our functions in the Corps of Engineers. I mean, those who work with us know that. We to optimize value, we have to get the planners and the designers, the people out and constructing these projects, the operators. We've got to get them all working toward a consistent value proposition. We're not going to get there through a strong AM department, right? That's not the goal. And Matt made an allusion to that. The SAMP does not speak to a large asset management department, or it speaks to getting these principles, just as this graphic displays here, to permeate all of our functions, so that you can get all the elements pointing together to realize value. So here you see the director's policy goals. They're derived from, as you go up. I'm sort of meandering around this graphic, but as you go up the graphic, you see at the top of the pyramid, USACE has civil works objectives, right? And they feed the policy goals. And then again, the objective of this system is to get those, provide some cross-cutting alignment among the main stovepipes that deliver value for us. So what's that mean for the AM program and for the asset management system that this strategy is animating? Well, it means that we need to do some work. We have some work to do to synthesize guidance, right? Each one of these stovepipes has their own guidance. We need to synthesize guidance. They can have their own guidance, but there has to be a touch to the guidance across the functions to make sure that the way we think about value is consistent. And the AM has to provide tools for everyone to practice good asset management, right? We need to provide the tools that help folks see value in whatever their functional role might be, right? So we have to devise business practices that optimize value for the physical assets. And there's obviously this is all a good bit of work connecting organizational silos to create organizational value, right? Mm-hmm. So next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy itself, right? That's what this talks about, and you know what the article is about. You know what happened there. How do we do that strategy? I think there's a lot of folks interested in that. I know there's with sister agencies. They're very curious to see the SAMP, the Strategic Asset Management Plan. They're very interested to know how it was constructed. So we built the SAMP through PDTs, and I got to give a shout out to Emily and Matt. You know, I may be the program manager, but these folks really guided the philosophy that I'm talking about. And that is that we take these organizational principles, these policies that the director gave us, and these are the ones across the top here, an objective for cross-functional integration, or for asset information standards, or for maintenance. These objectives were laid out for us in a conceptual way, and we structured PDTs around each one of these objectives, and we asked. There are about 35 members. And they were from across the agencies. They were from major subordinate commands. They were from facilities. They were from districts, headquarters, planning, real estate, E&C, engineering, construction. They were from operations and maintenance. They were truly from all walks of life in the Corps of Engineers. And they did some gap analysis, right? That's sort of one of the first things that we did is we thought we looked at each of these objectives and we asked ourselves, how are we doing? How are we doing with this one? How are we doing with cross-functional integration, right? And so what did the PDTs come up with? Well, obviously they identified some gaps in the current system, right? Not surprising, right? We didn't build ourselves around this. We built ourselves to solve specific complex problems, and sure enough, we found some gaps. And so at a high level, each of the 6 teams identified strategies. And they developed them a little bit too. So let me talk about that in a minute. But so take a look at the number of bullets within each one of these columns, just real quick. You know, these are the high level strategies. These are really the gaps that each PDT identified. If you read them, they kind of look like gaps. They read like gaps. And under each of these, each strategy or gap, that PDT also elicited some major needs. right? To address that gap, right? And by addressing those gaps, we'll achieve the goal. So if you think about it, you can see 1, 2, or 3 major strategy under each policy goal. So that team found that these were major gaps to achieving that policy. And if you look at one, let's look at the foster common understanding of investment prioritization, right? So that's over, it's the red one. And it's 5.1 under investment recommendations. You can see that. So you can imagine that's a big one, right? That one's going to be hard to address. And so the PDT didn't leave. They didn't just say, "Hey, we need to foster common understanding." That wouldn't have been very helpful. So beneath each of the strategies, discrete actions were called out to make that happen, to achieve that common understanding. So if you think about that for a moment, what might you do? If you know the Corps of Engineers, you've already got some idea. But I'll just, what's the Corps of Engineers need to do to improve, to achieve a common understanding about investment priorities? Well, first, we have to get our prioritization scheme to be coherent, right? And we have to get it aligned so that it can be understood, right? So that's one thing. And sure enough, the PDT said, "Hey, this is an action item. Let's work on priority coherence and getting alignment." There's if you read the SAMP, you see there's some meat on those bones. And then we have to do a lot of consensus building, right? Internally and externally. That was another need for that one. And then there's a big educational component, right? So you can imagine under each one of these strategies, by doing this, the PDTs, they developed the leading edge of what to do. They didn't just identify these gaps, but they sort of provided an initial what to do to implement the SAMP. And so the SAMP, this document, if you haven't read it, it's highly action oriented. It's a very action oriented document, which is what we need. So in the end, the SAMP lays out about 60 individual actions, like I was just kind of going through. I just named off a couple of 3 under that 5.1. Well, there's 60 total for all of these various objectives to be pursued over the coming 10 years. It's a pretty big ask for the agency. So Emily, do you want to talk about the impact?
Yeah. Well, I'm staying on this slide for 2 seconds, and we'll go to the next slide here in a minute. But as these policy goals are, all the audience is looking at these and the details of them, you can see that the last 3 are almost like a little bit of a family there, and they build on each other to improve the way that investments are made, which is obviously half of the policy goals within the SAMP. And that's really going to the second to last slide, Daniel, is really where the impact of asset management can really be fostered and among other things on the federal asset owners. So the next slide. Thank you, Daniel. The connection between the investments that the organization makes and to what matters to the public and industry is really where the SAMP goals and strategies and actions were geared towards, but also that's an opportunity for other federal asset owners to focus on, do this better. This can be done better by choosing the best investment. That's what asset management is really trying to do, right? Best investment at the right time and the right asset. So, and that leads to a better use of appropriation and better mission delivery. That is linked to being better able to measure these investments and implementing better performance metrics and analyzing those performance metrics in a more efficient way. And then also, of course, better prioritizing our investments to focus on those organizations' goals that you saw in the slide that Peter showed about the picture of the Corps' asset management system, their framework for their program. That is really just, again, one of the impacts and the outcomes that can happen when a coordinated asset management program is integrated across all those silos that Peter was referring to as well, on all those functional silos that exist naturally in any organization. but to really just to cross-cut those and understand that the life cycle of the asset really is important to analyze it all the time, and that each different function touches that life cycle in a way, and prioritize investments in order to improve the performance of the life cycle of whatever the life cycle of that asset is very important. And of course, lastly, is to improve investment decision making to accomplish those goals that I just talked about. And again, those three last investment goals are really important. But not only that, the maintenance goal of just improving everyday maintenance is, I think you saw in the evolution slide that Peter had used, what has been a very big focus for the Corps of Engineers in the past and continues to be so. So while that program has policy and guidance and tools around it as well, it's a key in ensuring that operations and maintenance investments are aimed at the right thing, and whatever the level of the organization is making that investment decision, is always really focused on the overall organization's goals and objectives. That was a little bit about our SAMP today, and that was this slide is intended to kind of wrap it up and show what other sister agencies out there or other providers of asset management services can have on federal asset owners. I know that I see a question in the chat here too, and we'd like to open it up and have a little bit of discussion if you'd like to, through a few answers to questions and answers in the chat here, and are very welcome to having a good, robust conversation. Like Matt and Peter, I don't know if we wanted to, or Daniel, how do you usually coordinate Q&A?
Yeah. So thanks, Emily. Thank you, Peter and Matt, as well, for that presentation. We're going to get into Q&A here for just a little bit. I just wanted to first let everybody know, if you wanted to, we've made the slides of the slide deck and the PDA certificate available in the handout section. So if you want to dig more into those strategies from the PDTs that Peter was talking about, or look at anything else in the slide deck in a little bit more detail, you can grab those from the handouts pane now. But let's jump into Q&A. And of course, if you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to put them in there. We're going to be kind of pulling from those here until we've gotten to everybody's, or we run out of time, whichever one comes first. So the first one here is from Gary Engel, past SME National President. Great to have you with us, sir. He asks, how do you ensure that required maintenance gets funded and accomplished on non-critical infrastructure as the focus, priority, and funding on critical assets and infrastructure increase?
Mm-hmm. Peter, would you want to talk a little bit about how the prioritization of regular operations and maintenance actions gets prioritized in the Corps? We didn't address it today, but our article does touch on the a budget framework that the Corps has implemented in the last several years, this 5-6 years, that is really trying to change the way they budget for operations and maintenance activities. It's called O&M 2020. And again, it's mentioned in our article. But Peter, do you want to talk about the organized, prioritized tool that is the organization's prioritization mechanism?
Yeah, I think we could talk about that. You know, it's focused on O&M, and I think, Emily, honestly, I think the way that question strikes me is the conundrum that, let's say, were we good at focusing on critical assets, right? Were we good at driving investments onto critical assets? How would we accomplish work on what are technically non-critical infrastructure, but infrastructure that still requires some attention. And because that is a conundrum, right? A prioritization tool aside, if the prioritization tool worked exactly the way that we intended it to work, it would be there would be limited ways to address some of these assets I think Gary's probably talking about. And Gary, I don't know exactly how long-term that would be addressed, although my sense is that our recognition of what is critical will probably evolve as we get better at sort of budget discipline and managing investments and driving into critical assets. A good example of this, the phenomenon that I'm referring to, is within the core, we consider recreation assets to be non-critical. And so someone might ask, well, how, if you get to the point that you have to focus all your investments on critical assets, how will you continue to have an aperture for the recreation assets? And that's a concern. So people have that concern. My learn and how I asset criticality in a more nuanced way than maybe we do today. And I think that may be what was driving that comment, that you read what's critical in the Corps' infrastructure inventory right now, you see a lot of things missing that you wonder, can you really leave that behind? And I think it's something that evolves. At least that's what we've found so far. There is some evolution as you go through the maturation process about relative criticality.
Good. Good.
Right.
And I will just one add, that was also, the Corps has been considering that critical versus non-critical assets for quite a while. It was back in the strategic investment framework when the asset management program was less mature than today. So, Daniel, do you want to go back to other questions?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of one of mine here. Because originally, like I said, the article was published in our September-October 2021 issue. And, since then, a little bit of time has passed. So I just wanted to know kind of what you're doing now to implement the strategies that were outlined in the stamp.
Sure. Peter, do you want to take that one as well?
I'm sorry, I'm looking for that one. Where is it?
Oh, that one's one of mine.
He
What is
asked.
it?
Go ahead, Daniel. Sorry, repeat your question.
Just what you're doing now, since the article's original publication in September, what you're doing now to implement the strategies in the SAMP.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, guys. I'm having a little bit of trouble, but I think the question is, what are we doing to implement the strategies in the SAMP right now? Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm having a little bit of audio trouble. I hope you can hear me okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you? Okay. Excellent.
Yes.
Well, actually, so the strategy itself is, it's with our senior executive group right now. We've gotten a lot of attention at the senior SES level, the senior executive service level in the agency. And so the director has not signed off on the strategy. I don't think it's going to have a whole lot of substantive changes, but the socialization process has taken a few months, which is good. I really wouldn't want it any other way. That being said, we are using it. I revised the program management plan. Once we got through the technical reviews and we got through sort of the deputy functional chiefs, all those stovepipes, once the deputies of those stovepipes signed off on it, I recognized that it was more or less a coherent strategy. So I've aligned the program's 5-year PGMP, the program management plan, and all of our resources over the next 5 years are aligned towards addressing those actions, those 60 subordinate actions that support each one of the strategies or the gaps that were identified. So there's 60 actions, and we've mapped them out over about 8 years, 7 to 8 years. And that is more or less our program management plan in the asset management program right now. So the way we implement it is by each one of the actions requires some analysis. It requires teams that either work in that business area or deliver that value stream to sit down and address the action item, and we structure them like project delivery teams, right? We give them an issue, we have them analyze the issue and establish what exactly is the problem here, or what's the opportunity. Sometimes what's the opportunity, and define that. And we get consensus about, this action item came out of the SAMP, but let's really chew on it a little bit, make sure we understand what this problem is or opportunity. And then we write a PMP and get moving, and we deliver it as a project. So I hope that gave a conceptual answer to how we're moving out.
All right, great. So here's another question here from Elliot Powers, who asks, does the Army Corps currently have a program of contracting to have periodic facility condition assessments that serve to provide proactivity in asset management? I'll throw that out there to whoever wants to pick it up.
Sure, right. Peter, you had talked about the operational condition assessment program. I wonder if that was the question was gauged, and I believe that process. Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm sure that's what Elliot's getting at. Is a lot of organizations call it a facility condition assessment. We call it operational condition assessment because the Corps of Engineers, I mentioned we have 600 or so dams, and we have a very robust dam safety program that addresses risks associated with dam failure. So they construct their hazards, and they do very asset management like activities associated with a single hazard, and that is loss of life associated with dam failure. Obviously in the asset management community, our aperture is a little wider than that. We would be interested in loss of life from really any number of factors that are within our agency's control, whether it be dam safety or any other. So although the activities are very similar, their view is a little bit different, right? And then the way that we characterize risk is a little bit different. So in the dam safety community, because they're so focused on that specific hazard, catastrophic actors like a 1,500 or a 5,000 year event are much more significant in that paradigm of loss of life associated with dam failure. For us, it's very much within the design parameters of the project. So that's where that operational condition kind of nomenclature comes from. We're not looking at risks in a catastrophic realm. We're looking at really what are we facing when we're operating this thing the way it was designed. And we send teams out. I think, Elliot, you're probably aware of that. Based on asking this question, you're aware that we send teams out every 5 years at least, and we do operational condition assessments. We look at our assets and systems and components at these facilities, and we ask ourselves, hey, what's the condition of this thing? How is it performing in the operational context? Is there any degradation associated with this that could threaten its performance in the operational context? What's the probability of failure of this thing in the operational context, right? So we do have teams that do that. I'm not aware of any. These are usually conducted out of the districts that I mentioned, the organizational unit that's usually within, over a few states of geography. And I'm just not aware that they do and that they contract that out. I'm not saying we won't. Some recent infrastructure investments are straining our ability, honestly, to meet a lot of our commitments internally. Design, construction is ramping up to meet the infrastructure bills that have come out recently. So it's possible that's going to happen, but we don't do it as much as probably the military program side does. I I think they probably have a more robust contracting arm for that kind of activity. Hope that answered that question.
Hey, Peter, one thing that we do contract out somewhat frequently is specific observations when we need to go beyond a standard periodic or operational condition assessment, need some specific NDT or testing or observations. But I think those are less facility condition assessment and more problem forensic associated, but we do contract that out some.
That's right.
All right, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Matt, for that. So I've got one final question here that, again, I'll kind of throw it out to all of you since you've been going through this process about, implementing an asset management, framework like this across such a large organization is, difficult, to put it mildly. But what do you think are the biggest hurdles to implementing something like this across a large federal organization?
Good. Yeah. Peter and Matt, I'll start and throw to you guys for your thoughts. But, well, the ideas that change management really professes is, I would say, one of the first thoughts I'm sure that's at everybody else's mind is this process of changing the way that the Corps of Engineers does business now. We talked a lot about how each functional silo or functional organization has their set guidance and their set business practices, and just the opportunity to and the awareness that something needs to be changed is the first hurdle, right? And then going into implementing many, many other things in the organization. So it does come down to the principles that change management implements, but and I feel like that was spoken about on those project delivery teams that Peter had spoken about quite as well too. But Peter and Matt, do you have any other thoughts on the biggest hurdles that you would like to pass on to maybe other federal organizations on the phone or those who support them?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Matt, did you want to offer something?
I'd say from a technical point of view, there's a lot of operational research and systems engineering concepts and tools and business analytics that can be applied to problems like this. And so I wouldn't say that the challenge is technical in nature. We can develop tools. We can do all kinds of analytics and tool sets, but delivering those to an agency that's busy and focused on delivering a mission today and getting their job done is disruptive. And so while you can look out there and see technical solutions, the cultural piece and trying to implement things into the daily life seems to be the biggest challenge, I think.
Yeah, and I will offer there's some unique challenges. That every organization, every large complex organization tends to be resistant to change, as Emily pointed out, and so a lot of, frankly, as Matt's pointing out, our problems aren't primarily technical, and the solutions really aren't that hard to find either. There's a lot of just working with humans, getting humans to adapt to just a little adjustment to the way that they think and taking into account some things that maybe they didn't in their professional training to begin with. But the Corps got some additional problems and that make it challenging. One is, as I mentioned, our facilities are all individually formulated for purposes that are site specific. You can't the values aren't terribly fungible, right? You can't say I've got 30 of these assets and I need to get down to 25, so I'm gonna move some of this value stream over, and spread it among the remaining 25. Ours really don't work that way. They generate value where they sit. for topographic and hydrologic circumstances where they sit. But even if we would recognize that some are more valuable than others, and we're willing to let some go, organizationally in terms of authority and the way that the financing works, we don't really have a lot of flexibility today as an agency to make those trade-offs. You know, a lot of organizations, they've got their assets, they've got 25 assets that are really high value and 5 that are kind of dogs, and they'll just de-invest the 5 and make sure that the 25 are fully operated and maintained. We don't really have that kind of flexibility. We have a little bit of flexibility to move resources around, but not a great deal. And so anyway, there's some structural issues that make thinking about asset management in a structured way and in a conventional way a little tricky inside the core, and that contributes to some of the trouble we have with just the normal cultural issues when you're trying to implement something like this. But I would say if you're trying to do something like this in your organization, count on some cultural resistance, because it's challenging a little bit. Folks are always afraid that if we look too hard at value, there won't be value where I am, right? There won't be value in the facility that I manage. So we've got to find ways to encourage people to think organizationally, and think about the organizational objectives, and recognize that in most cases, if there's something there and it's being maintained, there's some value there. It may not be the value that you anticipate. It may not be the value at the level that you currently operate, but there's some value there. That's why that thing is there. So it takes a little bit of cajoling as well.
Well said, Peter. Thank you. And with that, I think we are at time here. So thank you again, Peter, Matthew, and Emily, for the great presentation and the Q&A afterwards. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our attendees who have stuck with us all the way to the end here. If you're interested in submitting an article to the military engineer, you can visit our website for our editorial calendar and our writer's guidelines. We are currently open to submissions to our upcoming July, August, and September, October issues, both of which topics should really interest our attendees here: water planning and management and asset management again. So if you've got a topic or some insights that you'd like to share with the AEC industry, feel free to send it in. We'd love to take a look at it. For more education and training opportunities, there's no better place than our upcoming JTC conference. You could join your friends and colleagues this May from across the AEC profession and joint engineering community for 3 days of education, training, and networking in Aurora, Colorado. The registration is now open. And with that, make sure that you have downloaded your PDH certificate from the handouts tab. You can also grab the slide deck from there if you haven't already. So on behalf of SAME, the military engineer, and our featured presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.